So this is an article that a friend had posted to me, shared to me through Facebook, and it's about Cat Boyd. Basically, she was fighting for the Scottish independence, and I'll get around to explaining about that. Commonweal is obviously it's like a communist sort of movement, and a lot of people don't understand what socialism is. And she seems like a nice enough lassie and everything, but she's very much misguided with regards to socialism. She doesn't understand the problem with socialism, with regards to prices, what government price controls cause, and certain things, all to do with the economic calculation problem and why the Soviet Union ended up in the mess that it did. And there's many things in history that many people understand, many people misunderstand. A prime example would be the 1970s with regards to why the shortage at the pump had occurred. They think it's something to do with the Middle East. They think, something other than what it really was. It was actually due to the price controls, especially, President Nixon's price controls that caused such a shortage. And it's the same in Venezuela. They don't understand. They seem to think it's the United States that's causing the problem, but it's not. It was price controls, socialist price controls by government that drove prices down artificially and caused the shortages. And that's essentially what government's price controls cause. When government sets a price ceiling, which is basically where government artificially lowers the cost and sets a maximum so that the price cannot go above the maximum, that essentially is what causes shortages. And I have explained about that in a video previously, with regards to Venezuela. But anyway, continuing on, this is about Cat Boyd. 12 things you didn't know about Cat Boyd. It's quite an interesting thing, but I'll get around to the most important ones. Prolific socialist and Scottish independence activist Cat Boyd, who is seeking a seat in the Scottish Parliament at this year's Holyrood elections under the new coalition Rise, takes part in Our Serious. The first question: when you were a kid, what did you want to be when you grew up? She says, I think you're supposed to put something professional here, but the real uncensored truth is that I wanted to be Judy Garland in The Wizard of Oz. I was obsessed with the film. It's the film I've seen most of the time in my life, and I can still remember all her, she says, my lines. So anyway, the whole thing that gets me about this is the fact that, it was essentially capitalism that made these films possible. It's all the even the technology, everything that went into the capital that went into producing such things, and everything, it's unbelievable. And they don't understand where money comes from, and it's I don't know about herself, but this idea that people think they can print money out of thin air and somehow, having a fiat currency will somehow last them into eternity or something. I don't know. I've seen certain people coming out and saying crazy things where they think that it will never lead to bankruptcy. It's incredible what certain people believe. But money can really only either come from the private sector or the printing press. It can only really come from the private sector. People don't understand that essentially what the public sector does is it pays a rebate. Okay, so in other words, what I'm saying is that the public sector doesn't generate enough to pay tax money. It pays what's called a rebate. What that simply means is that the government who pays their wages, because that is after all where the public sector gets its money from, initially from the government. Yeah, I'll get around to explaining in a second, because it's not government that creates the wealth. We'll get to that in a wee second. But government pays their wages, okay? And what the government does is it takes back a percentage of what it initially gave them. That's not taxation, that's a rebate. So where did government initially get the money from? to pay their wages. The government stole it from the productive sector, which is also known as the private sector. So in other words, if you never had a private sector, you wouldn't be able to finance the economy. And Margaret Thatcher couldn't have put it any better. She said the problem with socialism is you'll eventually run out of other people's money. And the reason for that is because redistribution of wealth is not a wealth creator. You can't take wealth from elsewhere. You can't take money from elsewhere, reducing their wealth, and then redistribute it, and then say you've created wealth. You haven't. The only thing you've done is taken a percentage from elsewhere and divided it. You cannot multiply wealth by dividing. Wealth is not created by dividing. It's like saying that if you had £100 and you divided it 5 different ways, and you've got £20 each, you haven't created more out of it. All you've done is taken £100 and divided it to, 5 different ways, and that's exactly the problem. So you can't create wealth through dividing. And the end goal of socialism, as we know, is essentially all about, a moneyless based economy, and that alone is disastrous. And that's all in relation to do with the economic calculation problem that I have, described it several times in the past. This is the problem that, unfortunately, a lot of people in this country, even those who support the mixed economy, that it isn't just people who support socialism in general. It's people who support the mixed economy who don't understand what the economic calculation problem is, and why mixed economies are inefficient, why you couldn't place a mixed economy above a free market. And again, it is in relation to prices, and a lot of people don't, a lot of people unfortunately don't understand what prices are. They think it's an obstacle to getting the things that they want. They don't understand that prices are signals, and without the information of prices, you end up with inefficiency. And that is essentially why nationalisation is inefficient, because when you have government basically fixing and controlling prices, the government distorts the market's value. The market's value is basically what the consumer sets. It's what the consumer is willing to pay for something in the market. And when you distort that information, when you destroy the information of profits and losses, you end up with inefficiency. And the perfect example of that is the NHS with the long waiting lines. The long waiting lines didn't happen for nothing. They happened simply because of the economic calculation problem. It means that it's an informational problem. It means that it wouldn't matter how much money you fling at the problem. It wouldn't matter how many doctors or nurses you throw in there. It's not going to change the long waiting lines, because the government doesn't have the information to allocate to the right parts of the market. It doesn't understand the information of prices. And what ends up happening is the government ends up producing waste and misallocates scarce resources. This is called the misallocation of scarce resources, and it puts it into the wrong parts of the market, and it ends up causing a massive big long waiting line. It's inefficient. And this is something that, unfortunately a lot of people don't get that. But anyway, the likes of these films, they wouldn't have existed without, capitalism. You wouldn't say that we have a capitalist system today. And again, it's more like a scale. If you look in a scale between the freest countries in the world to the most oppressed countries in the world, the freer the economies are, the more capitalist they are. And that's just the simple truth of the matter. The more oppressed economies are all socialist. They're all government planned. And a perfect example of that is North Korea. It's socialist, and you compare that to capitalist Hong Kong, And Australia is another example where it has a relatively strong, capitalist, system within their economy. Although they again, in a scale, no one's ever said that there's ever been 100% socialism or 100% capitalism as a system. You know what I mean? No one's saying that there's ever been 100%, but essentially, when you look between it on a scale, the more capitalists have been more successful. So someone may argue, what about a country that ended up in anarchy, such as Somalia? Well, Somalia has actually been doing better off, but they descended into that simply because of the crisis of what socialism had caused to their economy. And another thing is, it's not as simple as saying just have a free market and therefore it works. It's not as simple as that. You need secure property rights. It's something that important. I may address that point in another video about secure private property rights, because it is important to have that, and it's important to have the rule of law. A free market's not going to operate without it. And this is the thing. Somalia was looking and basically asking advice in terms of trade, because this is another thing. In order to have a strong capitalism and a free market, you need free trade. This is something that the likes of Somalia were lacking. Things like the secure property rights and everything like that. So it's not as black and white as people saying, well, it's free market, therefore it's a failure, and all the rest of this. But anyway, I've went on long enough, and I'll move on to the more important points. So, who is your hero and why? So she says Bernadette Devlin. I don't know too much about, or Bernadette Michaliski, or whatever her name is. I can't really pronounce the name, which is fair enough. But this is the thing. It says her book, The Price of My Soul. Now, she's a hardcore socialist, okay? She's a hardcore socialist, but it was capitalism that made the book possible. It was capitalism, the capital that went into producing the book, such as a printer that printed the book itself, and all the capital that went into funding it. And then she's basically selling the book. It's a bit like Jason Inru, who, and I've got nothing against them. I've got nothing against them wanting to sell their own book and do things for theirself. That's the way things should be. Why should people like Cat Boyd, or why should people like Bernadette Michaliski be forced to live their life because of what other people dictate? These people should have the freedom to freely, start up their own business and make money and do well for themselves, as well as benefit others. And this is something that people seem to ignore. I don't agree with the low paid wages and all the rest of this, but when you look at a company like Apple produced a product that people voluntarily pay for, that they benefit from every single year. They're using smartphones where it's amazing technology and people benefit from it. People who say they haven't benefited from this touchscreen technology where they can take photos on the go, they can communicate and everything, they completely ignore that. It's almost like it doesn't exist. It's almost like as if, the benefit they gained from these companies didn't exist. But all they concentrate on is the money that the company makes in profit. That's all they're interested in. I would agree with the fact that the problem with the big corporations and the smaller businesses can't compete and all the rest of this, and it's the low paid wages. No one's arguing that. It's not, that itself is a problem, but that's not the fault of capitalism. This is what these people don't get. They unfortunately don't understand that. But anyway, our book there, The Price of My Soul, and this is a book that she's basically selling, and that's, that is capitalism. Having the ability to produce your own book and sell it. However, what is not capitalism is having a government restrict you from selling it, is having a government regulate the arse out of you to prevent you from selling it and limit how much you can produce. That's not capitalism. Capitalism is the freedom of the marketplace, the freedom of you being able to, own your own private property, own your own private business, to be able to produce whatever you like and however much you like, and sell it freely. And the only way an exchange takes place in the marketplace is if both parties agree upon that exchange. In other words, there's no force involved. This is basically what capitalism is. It's got nothing at all to do with imperialism. It's got nothing at all to do with colonialism. It's absolutely nothing at all to do with mercantilism, and this is something that people don't get. They seem to confuse the period of British history, of British mercantilism of the 17th and 18th centuries. They view that period as something, strongly capitalist, when it was far from it. Britain was on a fight and a transition over a long period of time, moving further and further towards capitalism, more into the 19th century. And that's why you saw in that's why you saw in 1843, in the 19th century, in 1843 you saw free trade, and that lasted until 1913. So that would, you would argue, would have been the strongest capitalist period, would have more or less been moving into the second industrial revolution. Although capitalism did help with regards to the wealth increase of people, but unfortunately, because everything's like a scale, but it's like I say, Britain was strongly mercantilist, and mercantilism was, more or less what you would call corporatism today. It was slightly different. I mean, it was something where it was more or less your kings and your queens who would dictate and basically determine through mercantilism. And you would have all these strong protectionist tariffs. Now, protectionist tariffs, these are all anti-capitalist, and this is what they don't get. In the United States of America, the history proves it. The very American Revolution we famously know of, the American Revolution itself was a capitalist revolution. The American capitalist class were the ones who formed the Boston Tea Party. They were the merchant capitalist class who fought against Great Britain for that very reason. They were fighting against the protectionist tariffs. They had enough. In fact, it was the capitalist class who led the charge to end the sugar tax, which was the sugar tariff, in 1764. And then in 1765, a year later, you had the Stamp Act. And then you had the Townshend Act, which is almost replicated of the Stamp Act. And they fought to end that. It was the capitalist class that basically fought and led the charge to end all three of those. And then, again, British mercantilism stepped in with this tea tariff. And this is where the capitalist class had formed the Boston Tea Party and fought and led the charge to end that, which, of course, sparked the American Revolution. So the American Revolution was basically a war between capitalism in the United States fighting for capitalism against the protectionist tariffs against all the British mercantilism. And that is the reason why people get confused. People think this mercantilism in Britain was somehow capitalism, and it's not. It isn't. If you have a government that's there to protect from losses, if you have a government that's there to lay on the tariffs, the protectionist tariffs, etc., that's not capitalist. Capitalism is all about the freedom of exchange in the marketplace. In other words, free trade, and that's why it's on a scale, because things are not as black and white as what people view things politically and economically, as a scale. As time moved on, the British people, who were basically against their own government, the British people didn't support, all of these wars, etc. That was all in the interests of the British imperialist government. And this is why when you hear people saying, well, you must be a supporter of imperialism and colonialism because you're proud to be British, that's just a black and white view. It's a very, very silly view. To be proud to be British is to be proud of what the British people achieved and innovated, and that wasn't because of government. That doesn't mean to say that you're proud of Britain because Britain went to war with all of these countries. However, there were specific reasons for why this had occurred. But to simplify it, you can't just say, well, you're proud of Britain because of imperialism and colonialism and all the rest of this nonsense. That's not the case. So, when you take pride in British history, you take pride in things like the Industrial Revolution, and it's what the people had fought for. They fought for capitalism, and the British people were basically opposed to their government. And this even goes as far back as the birth of what is known as Magna Carta. Now, the Romans had believed, this is important, and I don't care how long this may take, but it's important that you understand that the Romans believed that when they conquered land, they couldn't put someone of their own. They couldn't put a Roman in charge, because what it would cause is mayhem, because the people would despise it. The people would not take kindly to being ruled by a Roman, right? They couldn't accept that. So instead, what the Romans discovered was that the fact that if they conquered a land, they put someone who was, basically from that origin, from that place, in charge of the land, because the people would then accept it. And if you go back in history to the Normandy invasion, this is exactly why the British people were so rebellious, because when England was conquered, you couldn't really call it England at that time, but it was conquered by the Normandy invasion in the south, and basically it was a Normandy king who was put in place, and the British people, as a prime example, despised this. They didn't like it at all. And so eventually what you had was the British people, who were furious, rounded the king up and forced him to sign Magna Carta. That was the British people basically saying, you will live by our way. Right? This was the British people dictating, and basically saying that they're not going to be dictated to by a foreign ruler. Okay, so this is why Magna Carta had came about, and that very British spirit had existed for hundreds of years, strongly individualist, and it's why the Industrial Revolution kicked off in Great Britain. Okay, now you had other countries around the world who had more resources than Britain, a stronger workforce than Britain, yet you would ask the question, why didn't the Industrial Revolution kick off in those countries? Why did it start off in a country with fewer resources. And why did it kick off in a country with fewer in its populace, in its population, a few less in the workforce? So it happened because Britain was strongly individualist, and the British people, this is what I'm talking about, the British people weren't as acceptive of government as these other countries. For example, in the 18th century, when the British government was, the British government was on the path of its own, the British people stood against that. And it took years and years, as I say, for the British people to rise up and fight for, basically, they pleaded for free trade. And this was something that the political establishment of that time, the aristocracy, they didn't like. King George III, for example, he despised seeing the change that was happening in Britain. He wanted to keep Britain under feudalism, right? Because you have to look at it. Feudalism, it's not as simple as saying, well, in the year 1700, feudalism just all of a sudden died, and then in the year 1701, in stepped capitalism, and that's it. As if it's as black and white as that in history. It doesn't work like that. So it dies out over a period of time. It's like a transition. You understand? It's not black and white, so it's a transition. So over the course of the 18th century, you still had somewhat the transition, moving away from feudalism and moving more and more towards capitalism, little by little. And because of the mercantilism, the British government and the king, he did not like seeing the changes of what was happening. And eventually, the end of the 19th century, the end of the 1800s, in other words, you began seeing all the government intervention, etc. They used every excuse they could. So, it's not as simple, and history isn't as black and white as what some people try to make it out to be, as if to say, well, mercantilism is all capitalism's fault. So, it's just sadly one of these things that a lot of people don't, really grasp that. Anyway, so moving on, she does talk about who her hero is, and obviously, unfortunately, people like Bernadette don't really understand, and she's probably a nice enough lady, but she doesn't understand where the money comes from, etc. And it's really all the fault of government. It's all the fault of the political class, the mainstream media, everything that's brainwashed people into believing in socialism as if it can work. It really cannot. It's a disaster, and we've seen that in recorded history. I just want to touch upon the most important stuff, etc. Continuing on, that's not important. About what's our favourite song. This is quite interesting. This one. What are you scared of? Moths, butterflies, and accidentally saying something inappropriate in a live radio or tele debates. Away and get yourself to fuck, pal. She feels that way because the fact that and I don't mean to say it in a derogatory manner, because it's not the case. She's a nice enough lassie. She doesn't understand, and you can see that by a following thing she goes on, and I'll get to that in a second. But here's an interesting. I'll miss past that. It's not really that important. This one's quite interesting. When have you been wrong about something? She says, I've been wrong loads of times about different things, but I think that's okay. I think it's fine to make mistakes, and that we should allow other people in our circles to make mistakes and to be wrong too, especially in politics. You know, she's right in what she says. But the reason why people are uncertain and taking risks, because this is the problem. Economics is you have to understand economics. You have to understand about things like prices, etc. It's not about guesswork. It's not about taking a risk, and this is why. And again, it's not like I'm trying to make myself out as if, you know, I'm some expert, as if you know, I'm never wrong on anything. You know, it's not a case of that. But there's certain things that I do definitely know I'm right on. Things that I do definitely understand, that there's no way I could be wrong, because it's something you do have to understand, and I can give an explanation to it. For example, the economic calculation problem is not something you can argue with. You can't argue with the laws of supply and demand. That's another thing you cannot argue with, and this is something that sadly people try to do. It's a bit like, for example, people have knowledge about the laws of gravity. Well, you don't argue with the laws of gravity, you know, because if you don't have protection and you jump off a cliff, you're going down the way, you're not going up the way. It's just one of these things, that there's certain things that when you do understand something, then you can't be wrong about it. When you do understand it, when you have knowledge of it, strong knowledge, and I do have strong knowledge of the fundamentals, enough to basically state the reason why socialism is wrong, and state that position. But like I say, unfortunately, I don't know where she got her views from. I'm not entirely sure. I don't have the knowledge of that. I don't know whether it's been through family members. I couldn't really tell you whether it's been through the mainstream media or wherever, but she sadly just doesn't get it. She doesn't know why socialism basically fails. You know, I appreciate the fact that she can actually state, at least here, that she's prone to mistakes. And what this, psychologically, what this is telling you is she's uncertain. When someone says, I've been wrong loads of times and in different things, but I think that's okay. I think it's fine to make mistakes. When someone has this type of mentality, and then says, especially in politics, this is psychologically saying that the person is uncertain and is willing to basically state that they're more than happy to make mistakes, and if they do make mistakes, they'll hold their hands up and say that's, you know, fine. And that's something I do appreciate. There's times where you argue with people and they don't, they refuse to accept it. You know what I mean? It's kind of, it's one of these things that there's certain people who just, they're kind of religious of something, and they just completely ignore facts, and it's just a nightmare. As she goes on to say, when you take risks in politics, now this is the thing, this is what gets me, and it's a very, very big mistake. It's not a case of taking risks, it's understanding what given policies cause. You have to understand and carefully analyse what policies cause before implementing those policies. And if a policy has never been used before, then it's important to, you know, to carefully analyse how it, you know, how it's implemented and the actions it causes in practice. It's all well holding a theory of something, it's all well having good feelings of something. An example of that would be the minimum wage. It's all well having good intentions. The good intention being, I want everyone to have higher paid wages. That's a good intention. There's nothing wrong with having good intentions, but you cannot place good intentions above economic reality. And And from what history has proven over and over and over, is that every time that has been attempted, it basically led to a higher unemployment level. And this is the reason why Nicola Sturgeon said in her own words that in order to implement essentially the higher paid minimum wage, she would, adjust inflation to suit that. Now, you have to adjust inflation to suit that, because that's what you call compensating. In other words, you have to increase the costs. You've got no choice. That this is something that has to happen. You can't just have low inflation and just drive up a minimum wage. It isn't as simple as that. And it's this prime example of what I mean. It's all well having good intentions, but what happens when you put it into practice? You understand what I'm saying? So it's not just a case of just taking a risks and guessing what happens and having good intentions. You have to actually understand history and understand the given policies and the effects that they have on people. And unfortunately, this is something that a lot of socialists don't do this. And another big mistake that they make is they tend to think short term. They don't think long term, and that's a very, very big mistake to make. Another example of that was thinking short term with regards to the full time employment. They harp off about all this full time employment, but they don't understand the consequences of it. And just because you have it short term doesn't mean to say it's going to last in a longer period. So when you implement policies, you have to think about the long term consequences. And a great example of that is Norway. Norway is a country that was too heavily dependent on the natural resources, on the North Sea oil, and as a result of that, the North Sea oil is now starting to run dry. And by because of that, they've started to divest away from oil. And you might think to yourself, well, on the outside, sure, they've got an 800 to 900 billion dollar oil fund, but what the oil fund that they have was initially meant for was protecting themselves. It was never intended to spend on their domestic economy. Okay, that's an important thing to note. The oil fund was never intended for spending on the domestic economy. Now, see, outside of the energy sector, Norway has extremely high costs in everything. And what it means by high costs, what does it mean by high prices? High prices signify scarcity. It means they've got a severe lack of productivity outside of the energy sector. So now that the North Sea oil is running dry, their economy is in trouble, because the only way you're going to get productivity going again is reducing the tax rates. Now, they've got high tax rates, and that's not going to last forever, because their oil fund is not going to last forever paying for all of that. That won't last forever. It's expensive to pay for a massive big welfare state and everything like that. So it's not as simple as just... And this is another thing, economics is about efficiency. It's about how do you improve better improve the living standards of the masses, whilst using the fewest resources as possible. That's the whole definition. That's the whole point in the definition of efficiency. That's what economics is all about. How do you economise? How do you achieve it with using the fewest resources as possible? How do you better improve the living standards of the masses? And if you were to compare Norway to Hong Kong, where Hong Kong achieved doing that, going from one of the poorest places on earth to one of the richest cities on earth, Hong Kong achieved that with practically no natural resources. So if you were to compare Hong Kong as an economic success story, it's been more successful economically than Norway, because Norway essentially achieved that through abusing the North Sea oil, and as a result of that, it's now dipping into its oil fund and it's using it on its domestic economy, and that's not going to last long term. That's not going to last forever. So this is what we mean, it's all well thinking short term, but you have to look long term, and that's something people seem to have looked past. It's only been in the recent few years that Norway started to divest away, so in years to come you will see Norway progressively moving. I would hope, you can't predict it, but I would hope Norway would move more further and further towards capitalism. After all, how else is it going to get its productivity? I don't see it getting rid of its strong free market principles, to be honest, in its mixed economy. I can actually see it moving more and more towards a more capitalist based system, but that again depends on the type of person who goes in power of the country. Sweden, for example, it voted in a socialist government last year, and with it, I think, no, in fact, it wasn't last year, I think it was the year before, and within the space of a month, the socialist government was kicked back out. And that just goes to tell you something. But yeah, it's not a case of taking risks in politics. You have to actually analyse things and understand. And again, I'm not saying that as if in a derogatory manner. It's a fact of the matter. She says there's always a danger that you'll get it wrong. I'd rather take a risk and get it wrong. Well, that's the thing, you can't take risks. It's not a case of taking a risk, you have to understand it. And unfortunately, taking these risks leads to the sad, unfortunate consequences that lead to the very things that she basically purports to stand against. And then she says, "Dan, be a conservative and narrow in my outlook." That in itself is narrow, because it's the conservative politicians are not, your classical conservative. They aren't conservative in the true meaning of conservative. Like, Ken Clarke is a joke. Daniel Hannon's a true conservative, I would argue. But the likes of these conservatives like Ken Clarke and I would say David Cameron, I wouldn't say they are true conservatives. They're more cronyist in my opinion. So it's not as black and white. She says, to be clear, it is actually okay to admit that you were wrong about a tactical and political decision. I'm always suspicious of folk who say they're never wrong about these things. Well, it's not a case of me saying that I'm never wrong, but there are certain things that I do strongly understand, that I know for definite that I'm right about. And one of those things is the economic calculation problem that socialism's faced with, that why socialism fails, and you have to understand that. So anyway, this is the most important one. She said, well, the question asked was, what really makes you angry? And she says, injustice. When people are made to feel powerless, when people have their dignity robbed from them by an economic and political system that is just bloody indifferent to their lives. And it's this one sentence paragraph, this small paragraph here, that I want to touch upon, because she doesn't, and it's not her fault. I blame the system for why people don't understand it. They don't understand why socialism cannot be democratic. The only democratic thing about socialism is voting for it, to put it in place. That's it. That's the only democratic thing about it. And the reason why socialism ends up self-serving with a self-serving government, socialism is defined by central planning, and essentially it requires a planner. Okay, so people vote for a planner. In other words, they argue that that healthcare and education and everything should be in the hands of government through nationalisation. Okay, people could argue, well, okay, socialism is about workers' control over the means of production and all the rest of this, but we're talking about real world economics here, not theory, because you can't place theory above practice. But essentially what socialism is defined by is central planning. And when you basically have central planning, socialism fails because of the economic calculation problem, as I say. And this is because the government doesn't hold the information of prices, because what government's price controls cause is a distortion of market value. In other words, once the government destroys the information of profits and losses, it can no longer calculate basically what the value is. It can no longer calculate in order to know the information of profits and losses. In short, profits tell the market what to produce more of, where to allocate the scarce resources, and what to invest more in, whereas the losses tell the market what to stop producing more of, where to stop allocating scarce resources, what to stop investing in. Profits and losses can also tell you information such as how much to produce, you know what I mean? So, a prime example, when a business makes a loss, okay, when a business sees produce that's not selling, okay, when businesses see products that are not selling, it knows that in order to get rid of these products, it's going to have to drive down the cost of those products to sell them off, and that information is telling the business, I'm not going to produce more of these. What would be the point in me producing more of these if all it's going to do is cause me a loss? No business is going to produce more of what's making them losses. So in other words, they try to sell off what they have of that and get rid of it by reducing the cost on it and accept the losses. However, they won't waste scarce resources by producing more of what consumers don't want. And they got that information because of what losses told them, because of consumers' demand. Because consumers' demand said, by consumers walking into a store, consumers are not buying these products. Consumers' demand is telling the business, we don't want these products, okay? We don't want them. And the business can see that. So the business is not going to produce more because it's going to waste valuable scarce resources, and it's going to cause them losses if they do produce. And the goal of any business is to make a profit. So what the business does is it looks at what their most bought products are. That's basically the products that consumers have bought most of course. Common sense. And so the business knows from that information what to produce more of. Therefore it knows what scarce resources is required to provide and where to put it. You see, without that information of consumers' free choice and consumers' demand, without that information of profits and losses, you do not hold that information of what to produce more of, where to allocate the scarce resources, and what to invest more in, or how much to produce. You don't hold that information if you don't hold the information if you don't hold the information of profits and losses, basically. And that is why when government nationalisation through price controls, basically distorting market's value, distorting what consumers demand, when it's not left to supply and demand, when it's down to the government setting price controls, it destroys the information of profits and losses. And this is why you end up with governments, because they don't have the information of profits and losses, governments end up misallocating scarce resources into the wrong parts of the market and causing waste. And not only does it cause waste, it causes massive long waiting lines, such as what you see in the NHS. And it's a prime example of why you saw the long waiting lines in the Soviet Union, because the government didn't have the information of what to produce more of. It didn't have the information of what consumers' demand were wanting. For example, the mass shoe production in the late 1980s. The government basically produced more than 3 pairs of shoes, but the reason why there was massive big long waiting lines for shoes was because the shoes that the government produced and put on their market, the consumers basically didn't want them because it didn't match the tastes of the consumer. So the government doesn't hold the information to know. It doesn't hold the information to understand the needs and wants of the people. So when someone calls out for socialism, they're calling out for a government to essentially plan their economy. And that's essentially what happens when put into practice. It's all well talking about all this theory about getting rid of government and somehow all this redistribution and everything else is done by the people. Even then it just doesn't work. But essentially, through government's price controls, what they want, it ends up causing the shortages that they complain about. It ends up causing the waste, the inefficiency, and this is the main reason why socialism fails, through basically price fixing, through all of these things like basically central planning, because the government doesn't hold that information of profits and losses, and it ends up producing what consumers don't want and misallocating scarce resources, etc. And because it doesn't understand the information of what people's needs and wants are, what the government takes instead is the attitude that, okay, we're not going to produce for what consumers want, we're going to produce for what we think is best for the consumers. And there was no better example than this, right? Again, let me repeat that. Government takes the attitude that because they don't know what consumers want, government will basically take the attitude of, okay, we don't understand what they want or need, so what we'll do, we'll produce for what we think is best for the people, okay? And there was one democratic socialist politician of the Labour Party, J. Douglas, who in his own words said these exact words. This is a democratic socialist. He said, "The gentlemen of Whitehall really do know what's best for the British people than the British people do themselves." Think about that. Let me repeat that. He said, "The gentlemen of Whitehall really do know what's best for the British people than the British people do themselves." And the reason why he said that was simply because the government doesn't know the needs and wants of the people. It can't. And therefore it takes the attitude that the government knows better. So what you end up with is basically a government that leads on the path of its own. And that's essentially why you ended up with the political establishment that you did. It's sad to say that. It's the truth. And a lot of people don't get that, because they've been led up the garden path. They don't get it. So again, when you go back to what she was saying, she says injustice, when people are made to feel powerless, when people have their dignity robbed from them by an economic and political system that is just bloody indifferent to their lives. Well, why did it become indifferent to them? Well, simple for what I just explained. All of that nationalisation, the government couldn't know the needs and wants of the people. It destroyed the information of profits and losses. The government took the attitude of government knows better about prices than the consumers do. How do you know that for a fact? How do you know that the government took the attitude of thinking it knew better about prices than consumers? Okay, what does it mean by market value? Market value basically means that the value is set by the consumers. In a free market, it's all well saying that the businesses set prices. That's not true. Businesses do not set prices. Maybe in a fairy tale world they do, right? let's say you started a business and you set your prices, right? Who's to say the consumers are going to accept your price? They could go elsewhere and get it. They might not accept your prices. So it's all well you setting your prices, but it's all down to what the consumer is willing to pay for it. You understand? So therefore, when it comes down to setting prices, if you want to sell your products, you're going to have to set it at a price that the consumer's willing to pay for it. So in other words, the price is actually determined by consumers' demand. Okay, so in other words, what we mean by market value is what the consumer is willing to pay for it. Market value is set by the consumer. In other words, what a government price control is. A government price control is essentially the government saying, we understand better about prices than what consumers do. Okay, that's what it means by government artificially lowering costs, or artificially driving costs up. It's basically saying that the government knows better about prices than you, the consumer, does. And so it's one of these things that it ends up causing problems, and I've went into that before, and it would take a while to explain, and I'm not going to go that length of time into thingy, but essentially government's price controls end up leading to the distortion of market value. It distorts consumers' demand, it distorts the information of profits and losses, because if a business doesn't know the information of profits and losses, the government doesn't understand that information, it won't be able to produce what you want. It doesn't have the information. It doesn't have the information of how much to produce, what to produce, where to allocate scarce resources and all the rest of it. And that is the main reason why you see the long waiting lines that you do in the NHS. It's not because it's got a lack of funding, it's because it's a government's informational problem. In other words, the problem is not going to go away. And that's why the British Rail was inefficient. British Rail was a prime example. It had outdated trains, a severe lack of passenger journeys. Excuse me, but essentially it had everything. And it was running at nearly a £1 billion deficit. So, the nationalisation was inefficient, and it was because of the economic calculation problem. So, moving on, she says, I'm angry about people being sanctioned, about the fact kids are starving. I'm angry about workers getting paid a pittance and being treated like shit in their workplaces. I'm angry about trade union bill, but most of all, I'm angry that the 1% keep getting away with it. Okay. First of all, we can look at history, and in this part here, I'm angry about people being sanctioned, about the fact kids are starving. Right. If we look at recorded history, and this is an historical fact, prior to the Industrial Revolution, basically what you had was communal farming. Okay? You had your centralised agriculture. In other words, it was basically communism. Feudalism was very much similar to communism in many ways. It was very similar in the sense that what you had was a king, and the king would dictate and determine everything. He would be the sort of central planner of the entire economy, and basically you had to produce for what government said. In other words, you had to produce for what the king said. That's essentially what feudalism was. What the king said went. That is basically what feudalism was like. And under this period, and this is a simple fact, under this period what you had was communal farming. And especially in the United States, before the United States was formed in North America in 1607, you had basically the problem with regards to communal farming. Now I'm going to quickly read to you something from a chapter that it's in relation to the Pilgrims. Now this was from this time period. This is from this paragraph. It says, when the first settlers came to America in the early 17th century, the word capitalism had not yet been coined. But the most important ingredient of capitalism, private property, was responsible for their very survival, and indeed for the creation of America. As Tom Bethel explains in The Noblest Triumph, Property and Prosperity Through the Ages, the American settlers originally adopted communal ownership of land and property, and as a result of most of them starved to death or died of disease, a problem endured in later centuries by virtually every communist country that adopted collectivized agriculture. The first American settlers arrived in Jamestown in May of 1607. There, in the Virginia Tidewater region, they found incredibly fertile soil and a cornucopia, I can't even pronounce that word, of seafood, wild game such as deer and turkey, and fruits of all kind. Nevertheless, within 6 months, all but 38 of the original 104 Jamestown settlers were dead, most having succumbed to famine. 2 years later, the Virginia Company sent 500 more recruits to settle in Virginia, and within 6 months, a staggering 440 were dead by starvation and disease. Now, the reason why that had occurred was simply because of what was known as communal ownership of land and property. Okay, so communal ownership was basically collectivization of farming. Okay, collectivism, socialism, right? Communism, basically. And the reason why it failed was simply because of what we know as the free rider problem. And everything the king said went, right? So it's a bit like you I don't know if you've ever seen it. In fact, I probably won't get into it because it'd take a wee while to explain. But essentially, the free rider problem was a case that if one person in the group working in this collective group on the farm, let's say this one person drops his work rate by 50%. Even though this person has dropped his work rate by 50%, he's going to get the exact same as the rest of them. Okay? So he's going to get the exact same as the rest of them at the end of it, even though he's working 50% less. And essentially what happens is that when others find out they're getting exactly the same as the person who's working less, they begin to work less because they give in. And essentially this is what led to the lack of incentive in order to work. And how they solved the problem was through private ownership of property. In other words, this was the importance of secure property rights, secure private property, the importance of private ownership of land. They solved the problem by the private ownership of land. And this is why, entering the 18th century, you saw what was known as the enclosure movement. The enclosure movement was basically the privatisation of farmland, and it's the reason why in Great Britain you've seen private ownership of farmland for as long as, since the late 1800s, the late 1700s, the late 18th century, right? It was that saved people's lives. So you may then ask the question, what about the famine that occurred in Ireland? Well, Ireland was not Great Britain. Ireland was not industrialised like Great Britain. In other words, whilst Britain was strongly industrialised by the 1840s, Ireland was, the equivalent of what Britain was like before the Industrial Revolution. So it wasn't prepared for the famine that was about to hit them. And it was unfortunate and sad as a result of that. In other words, Ireland's fault was basically similar to what basically caused all the periodical famines before the Industrial Revolution. And so another reason was actually due to the British government. This is what we mean, because it's like I say earlier, it's like, just because, of what the British government's doing, it doesn't mean you support it. But there's certain wrong things, of course. It's just government intervention as usual. But anyway, you can see that basically what the privatisation of farmland did was put an end to all these, famines, and Britain had never seen a famine ever since. And yet fast forward towards the 20th century, where in the 1920s the Soviet Union centralised agriculture, and what the Soviet Union did was it redirected the rivers that fed the Aral Sea, which was once the 4th largest lake in the world. That sat between Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, and by the year 1960 you saw the Aral Sea dry up, and it dried up simply because of the centralisation of agriculture, simply because of the Soviet Union redirecting the rivers that basically fed it, and that ended up contaminating the land, and the entire fishing industry was destroyed. But most importantly, the centralisation of agriculture in the Soviet Union ended to famines. Basically, millions of people died of starvation. And the exact same thing happened in China when they centralised agriculture. In 1960, more than 30 million people had died of starvation. Again, the exact same thing in the African continent. The African continent had took on communism and centralised agriculture, and for decades on end the people were dying of starvation, even to this very day, because of what communism has caused. Not because British colonialism, British imperialism and colonialism was wrong. We wouldn't argue with that. However, to blame it on British imperialism or colonialism is just wrong in itself, because Britain left decades ago. Again, it doesn't take you decades to get out of poverty. It doesn't take you decades to get out of that severe problem. The reason the problem occurred, just like what happened in America, in North America in 1607, was because of the communal ownership of land and farming. And if you don't have secure private property rights, you're going to end up with the severe problem that you basically seen. And that's the reason why it caused so much starvation. And you can draw a contrasting difference between capitalist Hong Kong or capitalist Singapore. Look at all of these, capitalist, more free market type of economies. Do you see all of these famines, etc.? Do you see millions dying of starvation? Of course you don't. But there's no such thing as this idea of perfection, of what people believe in, where you have an economy where there's no such thing as rich and poor people. That doesn't exist. But most importantly is the fact that in every socialist movement it has led millions. In fact, you would say an estimated 100 million people died of starvation, all thanks to socialism. And that socialism wasn't just coined in well, let's just say socialism didn't just come about in the 19th century. It didn't just come about in the 1840s. Socialism itself, as for what it is, collectivism, had been around for, centuries. Even long before, long before the likes of William Wallace and etc. You thought going right back to a period of Plato and Aristotle, etc. Even right back to that time period, Plato and Aristotle argued between socialism and more capitalism, one being more for a planned economy and the other basically being against. So this is what I mean, that even it goes back to ancient Greece. It's just it wasn't coined the same, and things had adapted and changed over time. Capitalism was basically known as meritocracy. Don't get confused between mercantilism and meritocracy. Meritocracy is basically a merit-based system. In other words, you're rewarded for your merit, for your success, for how hard you work, for your skill, etc. That's basically what capitalism's all about. Anyway, you get the point, and I think I've went on long enough. But it's this sad thing where people like Cat Boyd, she doesn't understand. We're going to just quickly touch upon the last part. I mean, like I say, it's the starvation is basically caused by socialism, and there's Venezuela. Venezuela being the prime example, thanks to all the socialist policies. They've got massive, big, long waiting lines and food shortages. It's ridiculous. And unfortunately, a socialist politician has now decided it's a good idea to print fiat currency out of thin air, as if that's really going to save them. They're going to end up hitting an economic collapse. It was socialism that caused their hyperinflation. Anyway, she says, I try my best to turn my anger into positive energy. And I feel like a lot of us in our RIC, which is the Radical Independence Campaign, and Rise and other campaigns and I'm involved in, have been successful in turning the collective rage into a real force for change. Well, I'm telling you this. I mean, if someone, and it's sad because she doesn't understand, if socialists got their way in this country, you would find food shortages within the space of a month. You would, and that's not even a joke. You seriously would, because there's nothing more important in economics than prices. But I want to touch upon this last one. This is quite funny. She says, knowing that there's a bunch of people out there who have my back, and them knowing that I have theirs feels good, which is, there's nothing wrong with that. But so what she goes on to say here, because this question here, if you could spend an hour with anyone dead or alive, who would it be and what would you ask them? Well, she basically says Margaret Thatcher. I'd tell her all about how her greatest legacy, New Labour, was falling apart. This is a confusion because Thatcher was not the same as Thatcherism. Thatcher supported the free market, but Thatcherite economics was anything but. Right, it was put into practice. It was anything but that. She actually increased the financial regulations, etc. But that's one of the things. But it's the fact that she says that she would tell her all about New Labour and all the rest of this. She says I'd show her videos from the referendum and ask how she felt about her beloved Britain holding together by a thread. Well, it's one of these things that she hated. So the reason why Margaret Thatcher hated socialism was for the reason it led millions to their death, and it led people to the very disaster that she's saying she's supposed to be against, like starving children, etc. But anyway, I've went on long enough, and I think it's pretty tedious. But this last bit, she says, I'd show how there are hundreds and thousands of young people switching to the left-wing ideas. Well, that's nothing to be proud of, by the way. I mean, that's they're going to get their eyes open. They really, really are going to get their eyes open, and this isn't a game. The fact that millennials, people my age and younger, have turned to socialism, they're really going to get their eyes open, and if Bernie Sanders gets in as president, by Christ, it's going to be a big laugh, because not a laugh for people who are going to suffer as a result of it. That's not nice, but it'll be a laugh because this democratic socialism is going to prove again it's a failure. And what you're going to see is people again trying to deny by saying, oh, it just hasn't been tried and tested in the right way yet, or Bernie Sanders isn't a true democratic socialist. That's just absolute nonsense. It's nothing at all to do with Bernie Sanders. It's not Bernie Sanders that will make it fail. It's just it will fail. It will fail because the fact of the economic calculation problem, and the longer that you deny this, well, let's just say, in order to deny it, is basically saying you don't care about the poor, that you purport to protect. So, if anything, I would watch your back. So anyway, thank you for watching the video, and I shall talk to you later.